I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving an overview of TSC and a bit of an idea of where research is at. The idea of this is that sometimes it can be challenging with each of the specialists coming and deep diving into their own area to have, I guess, a universal view of what's happening in TSC more broadly. I also think that I get really lost sometimes in the international research meetings, and I've been involved in this area and have a science degree. So I think sometimes it's good to try and give a layperson summary. Having said that, to any of the professionals watching, I will probably say slightly the wrong thing. Give me some leeway, I'm doing my best. So just a quick overview of TSC. You guys probably know all this, but I know we have a couple of new people in the room that are new to tuberous sclerosis. So just a quick one. So it's actually a fairly common rare disease. We talk about it as a rare disease, but the rare disease community is made up of a lot of patient populations that have far fewer people than we have in TSC. So about 1 in 6,000 live births, and that means we have about 1 baby born each week in Australia. Add that all up around the world, there's 1 million people. So that's quite a lot of people living with TSC. And I'm privileged to also work with TSC International, and it's absolutely fantastic, the collaboration that we're getting around the world and the improvements that we're making in middle and lower income countries. So TSC can be inherited. As many of you might know, once you've got tuberous sclerosis, you've got a 50% of chance of passing that on to any children that you have. But for most people, when we look at people that have TSC, tuberous sclerosis comes with no family history. It's considered a sporadic mutation. And as you guys also know, huge variability. So we don't really know from one person to the other, for the most part, what's going to happen with tuberous sclerosis. And just because you, for example, don't have neurological symptoms in childhood, it doesn't guarantee that your kidneys or your lungs won't become major medical problems in the future. So it's one of the big challenges. I won't spend too long on this picture. I'll let each of our speakers talk more about different aspects. But I mean, the main message is TSC can affect any part of your body. We tend to talk just about the ones that cause the most problems. But as you can see, all through the body, and that's not even everything that can happen. So it's a complex disease and it's hard to live with. But as you can see, a lot of those things don't happen in most people. This is a picture we like to talk about because TSC is something that's going to stay with you for your whole life or the whole life of the person that's in your family. And this shows how those symptoms and signs and symptoms of TSC develop over time. The lighter green this is from a paper that looked at a subgroup of women presenting in adulthood with tuberous sclerosis and usually lung involvement. So the lighter green shows the data of that group. So you can see that although we talk about, for example, serpendimal nodules in the brain, having quite high penetrance or being quite common in the population, you can see in that subgroup, they actually saw those things later on in life. So, you know, you think about variability between people, but also across the lifetime. But what does that all mean for an actual person living with tuberous sclerosis? This is some data from our 2014 survey. So thank you to those of you who filled in that survey. We've actually got the research poster out in the break room today. And this shows what is it that actually Australians with tuberous sclerosis report impacts their life the most. So you can see that epilepsy comes out near the top, and then the next cluster are a group of aspects of tuberous sclerosis we've started coming under the umbrella term TAND, and that's what this morning's session is going to be about. It stands for TSC-associated neuropsychiatric disorders. We borrowed the acronym from the HIV land where they talk about HAND, and so you can see things around learning, intellectual disability, challenging behaviours, mental health problems. They're the aspects of TSC that also have a really big impact and can be really challenging to get help for as well and recognise. So we're going to spend this morning hearing from both Beck Mitchell from a childhood point of view from here at the RCH, and also having a group discussion for the adults or people that are caring for adults with TSC. So that unfortunately I couldn't get a speaker in the adult sense, which I think is a sign of how challenging it can be to get help in this area, and hopefully we can fix that. So we'll be talking about that. You can see the other aspects of TSC that might be really common, but aren't reported to have major impacts on people's lives. Now, the thing I was supposed to talk about, and I've got about 10 minutes, is what's happening in TSC research around the world. It's challenging to talk about research to people who aren't researchers, and I know this because I'm not a researcher and I sit in those meetings and I get a little confused, but this sort of framework of thinking about medical and scientific research can be really helpful. So you can see that research goes through phases, and some TSC research will be basic science research, trying to understand how the cells work, how the chemicals that they produce work in our bodies. Then we look at, from that, what we learn from that, we funnel that through to the next stage. So things that look promising, that help us with whatever we're trying to do, say cure or help people with tuberous sclerosis, we take those ideas through to later stages. So looking at what we've learnt about how cells work or how genes work through to what could actually help someone. So do we, for example, have a medicine that might interact with those chemicals that those cells are producing? And we take all that all the way through to the research that we hear about more often as people living with this condition, clinical trials of medicines or approaches that might help us. So today, have a think about that when you hear about research. Most of the things we're going to hear about are going to be on that right-hand side, but some of the things that I'm going to talk about are things that are happening a little bit earlier. The short story with this is we need a lot of work on the left to get to things on the right. So a lot of the research, particularly in the US, is around things on the left, really understanding how TSC cells work. So the first, I've gone too far. There we go. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about was probably the biggest change that's happened in tuberous sclerosis in the last, say, 10 to 15 years is new medicines that we are calling as a class of medicines Mtor Inhibitors. So down the bottom you can see the two examples of those that might be familiar to you. And I suppose I just wanted to take you through this process of how we got there. So a lot of work, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, led us to identify the genes that were causing tuberous sclerosis. So we found TSC1 and TSC2, and then nothing really happened for a little while. And then someone realised that they knew what pathway these were involved in. And I'm not going to show you a picture of the mTOR pathway, but imagine a whole lot of boxes and lines. And that shows how all the proteins that help our cells talk to each other work. So we figured out what the genes were, we figured out what protein those genes were making, and how that interacted in our bodies, and the way that all these chemicals work to make our bodies work together. We linked it to that pathway, and what was amazing in tuberous sclerosis is that we already had a medicine that we knew worked on that pathway. So in TSC, we got a bit of a fast forward card. We went straight to a point where we said, we've got this compound, let's try it. And we had some very boundary pushing doctors that tried that in their small patient numbers and showed some effect. So we actually got very, very quickly to a stage where we were testing this in humans. So trials, I think, began in about 2007. And I think it was 2012 or 13 where we had the first approval in Australia. And we've got those approvals. So, sorry, I've got an Australian icon. So every time there's something happening in Australia, I'm going to try and remember to tell you about it. So we had Australian sites in the first trial, which was those medicines being used for SIGA brain tumours. And I think that Simon will talk more about that in his session this afternoon. And we've had some Australian sites in epilepsy as well. Which is not yet an approved indication in Australia. And you can see my orange arrow there means that we're sort of still iterating through this in TSC. So the questions that we've got about mTOR inhibitors are, what other signs and symptoms of TSC might these medicines be useful for? We thought originally, 10 years ago, maybe this was going to be a cure. It's not a cure, absolutely not. It's another option that we have. So what else could this be used for? We've got trials happening in neurocognition that have shown really not amazing results. So we've shown patient-reported and anecdotal responses, as some of you might have experienced in your own families. But we can't sort of make that appear on the instruments that we've got to measure these aspects of TSC. So how else can we research this area? And there's groups in a lot of the US and the UK looking at this question. Who benefits from these medicines? As many of you know, you consider this medicine, you go, well, some people say it's amazing, and some people it didn't work at all. So how can I predict? Do we just have to try it? How can we look at large groups of people that are taking this medicine and see what it is that worked for them? When should we use them? At the moment, our guidelines suggest, for example, a growing SIGA. There's a fair lot of judgment there. How can we give our clinicians the information to make better decisions about Say, for example, if we go untreated, how quickly will a SIGA grow? And there's studies, actually including one in Australia, looking at, say, the natural history of these SIGA brain tumours. Can we combine these with other therapies? So there's a lot of work being done in LAM in particular, the lung condition you'll hear about this afternoon, looking at could we combine this medicine with another medicine. So one of the things this medicine does is actually helps keep cells alive. And how could we help those cells die? I always think that's really funny. Like the example that one of the researchers, Lisa Henske, used is like pushing lemmings off a cliff. We want to try and push these cells over so they die, rather than just kind of deactivate them or stop them from causing trouble. And the other area which relates to some of the research being done here in Melbourne as well as Brisbane is, could we treat early so that we prevent the signs and symptoms of TSC developing? There's a group of leading TSC researchers that are pushing a program of, I suppose, research planning, actually called TS Cure. The idea being, could we start intervening so early that these signs and symptoms of TSC don't develop? Other questions outside of Mtor inhibitors is the basic science, the left-hand side stuff. So really understanding more about how cells work. And then based on that understanding, do we have any other things that we know about or we could develop that change the way those cells work? So some of this research, for example, is drug screening. We take a TSC cell, we have a cell that's got TSC in a petri dish in a lab, and we run chemicals across that and see what happens. That's the level of understanding I have of that process, but the idea, and it's done in lots of cases, especially in cancer, is we find something that works and then we can push that drug through. We've got lots and lots of compounds. One of the great things about TSC, well, one of the awful things about TSC is that it affects every part of the body and it affects a pathway that's really fundamental to how human bodies work. One of the good things is we've probably got some drugs that already act on that because it's not something that people haven't been researching. Because it's so fundamental to how our bodies work, there probably are other medicines that interact with that process. So that's drug screening work, which pretty much is all happening overseas. These are the parts of the research meetings that I kind of get really lost in. But there was an interesting study talking, for example, about why is it that we get SENS, which is something Simon will explain this afternoon. Why do we get SENS in that part of the brain? What is it about those cells in the lining of the ventricles that makes them likely to develop SENS? What is it about the kidneys in particular that causes tumours? And so by investigating from the symptom back down, do we understand something about the mechanisms in those kidney cells that means they're more fragile and more susceptible to grow TSC tumours? Once we understand that, could we switch off that sort of aspect of a kidney cell, for example? So all that sort of stuff, that's the level I understand it, but I guess I want you to know there's a lot of stuff happening. And hopefully we see some of that filter through to the next stage that might end up changing people's lives. Now, the questions I'm more confident explaining that the researchers are looking at include what do we know about how TSC changes through a person's lifetime? So the natural history studies. And we have Australian participants in a database called TOSCA, which stands for something to do with TSC, but essentially tracks people through their lifetime with really comprehensive data. And that allows researchers to look and answer questions of, is there a cluster of people for whom TSC progresses this way? Is there another group for whom if you have this sort of symptom or this sort of biomarker or this sort of gene change that this is more likely to happen? So there's heaps we don't understand about that, and research there I think is really interesting. Can we predict which people with TSC are more likely to develop signs and symptoms? A lot of the work in this space is in early childhood and looking at early predictors or biomarkers, things I can see about this person early before their sign comes up. So for example, looking at EEG results in a small baby, looking at those brain waves and saying, oh, I can see differences. They're not seizures, but they're differences in the way that brain is working. Is that predictive later on? If I follow this child, are they more likely to develop, for example, autism or developmental delay? And I think Beck might be talking a little bit more about some of that stuff, maybe? Okay, a little bit. So, and then the cure stuff. Sorry, that Australian map is supposed to be on the bottom one. But does the risk reward make sense for earlier intervention? So that relates to the TS Cure program that's trying to push the envelope a little and say, could we do trials in babies or even before they're born if we find TSC earlier? And would that make a difference? And are the downsides of this medicine actually worth the potential reward. And that's where the idea of predicting who's at more risk comes into play as well, because a different subgroup has a different risk of developing the symptoms that we're trying to prevent. So all of this stuff is working together to get us to the next point of refining how we use the existing tools that we've got. And that includes tools like epilepsy surgery or existing anti-epileptic drugs. Does cannabis, CBD, which I think Simon's going to touch on as well this afternoon, does cannabis work for intractable epilepsy and TSC, and which product? And again, do we know which people are more likely to benefit? My last slide, I think, before you get to hear from Brett, is what is this going to mean in your lifetime? So it's all very well for me to talk about, It's all very well for me to talk about what might happen in the next generation of people born with TSC, but what does that mean for you? So potentially what might happen is we might get more approvals for Mtor inhibitors. So for example, we don't yet have approvals in Australia for treating the lungs or epilepsy. So we're expecting epilepsy approval, at least approval for use, and fingers crossed listing on the PBS within the next 6 to 9 months, because the evidence is reasonably good that it might help some people. So will there be more? We don't know. As I said, the evidence around neurocognition is challenging to get and mixed when different research groups have looked at it. Maybe there will be more coming. We're hoping that the clinical research, and to some extent this is kind of low-hanging fruit, can we get more information about what resources, what medicines, what talk therapies, what approaches to managing behaviour actually work in TSC for these neuropsychiatric aspects of tuberous sclerosis. At the moment, our clinical guidelines are very focused on screening and diagnosis. So saying, let's look for this, let's look for anxiety, for example. But once you've decided that this person with TSC does have an anxiety disorder, the only thing... Met, North Building, 4th floor, Cockatoo, 443, Neurosurge. Met, North Building, 4th floor, Cockatoo, 443, Neurosurge. The only thing we've got at the moment is approach that anxiety disorder as the same way you'd approach someone without TSC. We're pretty sure some approaches are going to work better than others, but we don't really have that outside of an individual clinician and person's experience. And so there's some work happening to try and gather that from the ground up, which I think is a really interesting approach. We may get more epilepsy treatments or more information and data on which to choose which epilepsy treatments might work for a particular individual. We're hoping a lot of that stuff will get reflected in revisions to our surveillance and management guidelines, because we have this huge challenge in TSC. We have a challenge in Australia. We certainly have a challenge in lower income settings of figuring out what needs to happen and persuading the people with the funds or the decision-making power to make that happen for people with TSC. So there's a lot of push in TSC International for making sure that as much as possible gets into those publications, because they're really useful tools for our advocacy organisations. And of course, what I hope will happen, but is much harder to predict, is whether we will get some results from that left-hand side of that funnel through to potentially another drug therapy or another approach that might be have a big impact on tuberous sclerosis. We'll see what happens with all of the basic scientists, with all of their proteins and genes and things that go over the top of my head a lot of the time. So that's all I wanted to say about research in TSC. I hope that gave you some context. I'm really happy to talk about it more. It is a really tough area to understand, but I hope it's given you some hope that things are happening. There are millions and millions of dollars being spent on tuberous sclerosis research around the world, and it is making differences to the lives of people with TSC alive today, and we think it's going to make a big impact on people born in the future with this condition.